Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. I hope you've had a good summer, and we're back to the hard grind of Gresham Economics Commerce Lectures again. The overall theme for the 3 years of lectures is the economic impact on the Western economies of the industrialization of the emerging economies, which I described in my very first lecture, and I think I proved it to have been the greatest ever economic event. And what we're doing today is disentangling the link between globalization and inequality. We're trying to understand what's driving the changes in inequality, and we're looking at a different but related issue, which is world poverty, and seeing how globalization relates to that. Last year's lectures, other than the 7th one, which was a sort of one-off special subject dealing with transport in London, I concentrated on the economic building blocks. So we went through the key points. How big was globalization compared with previous economic events? And I needed to show it fairly big because I had to show that its impact is non-marginal, which is the essential concept, essential theme underlying all this. The super competitiveness of the emerging economies, the impact on worldwide inflation through the effect of commodity prices. We updated Keynes to show that you get slightly different results if you take account of the impact on inflation and on the balance of payments for a Western economy like the UK, and so it tends to, globalization tends to mean lower, slower economic growth. And then looked at a specific policy issue, which is how to boost growth by reducing the cost of living. We built in a sort of an economic superstructure while we've been rich, and now we're adjusting from being a rich economy to being a middle income economy. We need to dismantle some of that superstructure to a level which is more appropriate for our current state in the world. And then I looked at the impact of savings worldwide, particularly the Chinese savings glut. And the final lecture on the series was who were going to be the winners, who were going to be the losers, and I suggested we needed to move away from the concept of bricks and think instead about the people who are doing well, the people who are doing badly, and the people who have just got lucky. This year, I'm handling a number of policy issues. Today, this huge topic of inequality and its relationship to globalization, and also world poverty. Next month, the topic is going to be, should the UK adopt money GDP targets? We've got a new governor of the Bank of England, the first to come from abroad, Mark Carney, and he's instituted forward guidance, trying to give some indication of future policy. And what I'm going to argue is that this is a way of building on his approach, which I think is, in general, superior to the techniques that he's tentatively adopted so far. My December lecture has a provocative title, Was Karl Marx Always Wrong? And it looks at the impact of globalization on the distribution of income between wages and profits. And my argument is, to some extent, that what Karl Marx said didn't actually happen. He reckoned that the poor would get oppressed forever and get exploited forever. It didn't turn out like that for most of the 20th century in advanced economies. But it may be starting to happen now, a bit, and that's what I'm going to look into. And I'll also look at the policy prescriptions, because although I think that Karl Marx probably got a certain amount of his analysis right, I think he was not all that brilliant with his policy prescriptions. They tried them in Russia, they didn't work. They tried them in China and changed tack pretty damn quick when they realised they'd have to starve 40 million people because it didn't work. In January of next year, I'm going to look at one of the results of studies that we're currently carrying out for the Royal Navy, showing how the UK, which for most of its recent history has been a consumer-based nation, is going to become an exporting nation. It's going to have to become an exporting nation to pay its way in the world as a result of globalization, and what that means for all sorts of things like household income and so on. The Royal Navy at one point were going to offer a ship for us to have this lecture, but unfortunately the ship is being used to oppress Somali pirates at the moment. And you can make up your mind whether it's a better use than being a venue for a lecture for us. However, they have said that they will leave the pirates unoppressed for a short period at some point next year, if I can provide a suitable topic for a lecture. So we should have one of these lectures on the boat. In February, I'm going to talk about the euro, if it still exists by then, and what globalisation does for that, because of course it has a differential effect on the middle-income economies in southern Europe from its impact on sophisticated economies in northern Europe. My final lecture in the main series this year will look at the tough political choices. Do we basically have to match the very low shares of government spending with no welfare that we have in the emerging economies, or can we search for a sort of middle way where we combine some of what we've traditionally done in the West with some of the things that they do in the more competitive countries in the emerging economies? I think it's going to be quite a tough lecture to go through, but I think it sets out the economic backgrounds to some very interesting choices that have to be made. Now, the final lecture, my seventh lecture is normally on a sort of fun topic, and the final lecture is going to be on the possible inverse correlation between sporting success and economic progress, with special reference to Ashes cricket. And you may notice that as the Australian economy has prospered, their cricket's got worse. However, the short-term trend is that they seem to be doing a little bit better. They seem to be doing a little bit worse, and we seem to be doing a little bit better. So that doesn't bode well for the Ashes this winter. I'm trying to get the latest incarnation of Sir Leslie Patterson, the Australian cultural attaché, to sponsor this lecture, but so far I can't get hold of him. Our gallery's in the pub somewhere. So we may find we get free tinnies and Fosters as well, or possibly even Australian wine. Now, the lecture today is going to I'll start obviously with the background, then I'll look at inequality within countries, with special reference to the United States, inequality between countries, and they move in very different directions. And then I'll look at some of the potential causes of the rise in inequality. Now, as you can see, this is pretty heavy going. So I thought I'd lighten it a bit, and I've got a little bit of special focus on inequality in football, and how the salary gap between the richest soccer players and the poorer soccer players has increased. It sheds a little bit of light on the topic, although some of the processes involved are not entirely the same. But then, what I finish on is what's the key point of this, which is actually, although football and other rich players are interesting, what economics is all about is trying to stop people being poor. And I'm going to look at all the latest data on what's happened to poverty and reach some conclusions on that. So that's where we go. Now, the last year's lectures went through all the global shift, intense international trade competition, super competitive economies, rising real prices of natural resources, which is what's been helping Australian economic growth, although with the prices dropping in the last couple of years, they've had a cyclical setback. Slower growth in the Western world, faster growth in the emerging economies, and the Chinese savings glut. The Chinese save 50% of their income, proportions remained unchanged since when they were 2% of the world economy. Now they're 12% of the world economy. Their savings are 6% of world GDP, which is non-trivial, and creates a glut of funds which keeps interest rates down. Right, inequality. We've just got some new data on inequality around the world, but the most detailed stuff is available in the United States. And because it's a big economy, there are sort of fewer of distortions, and so the data tends to reflect better the pure play of economic forces. The data is kept, and there's a website with all of it, and it goes around many different parts of the world, by the Paris School of Economics, and the main authors are people called Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez. I don't know if I pronounced his name properly, it might be Saez. The database focuses on top incomes, which is useful, although it's important to note that actually what we're really more interested in is what's happening to the great bulk of people. It's fascinating to get concerned about the top 1%, but actually it's only really relevant to the extent it impinges on everyone else. Now, I'm going to build up a picture. Now, imagine the United States population being divided into 1,000 groups by income, and it's hierarchically, so the top one of 1,000 is the top 0.1%. And I will go through, starting with the groups from 100 to 50, and working my way up. And I'll also add the 0.1, which in other words, the 0.1% at the very, very top. Now this shows us what's happened for those between 50 and 100 of those 1,000 groups. In other words, those between who are in the top 10% but not in the top 5%. And what you can see is the historical graph shows that since the war, the share of the top 10% but not in the top 5% has trended upwards. There's been a cycle recently, but in general it's edged upwards, although it has not reached pre-war levels. Adding in those in groups, those who are in the top 5% but not in the top 1%, the trend there is the red line here, and you can see that the picture is similar, but the graph is tilted more sharply upwards, and particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, it's moved up a bit faster. Now the next group is those who are in the top 1% but not in the top 0.5%. Again, it's the same sort of picture. Their share has risen, but the timing is a bit different. This group, its income levels actually edged down from 1946 to 1985, its share of total income, but has recovered since. As we move forward, excuse me, it's a paper flying all over the place. Actually, if you're doing a radio interview, it's the best thing to do. Once you've finished your notes, just throw them on the floor. That way they don't sort of come back and confuse you. If you go into the next group, this is the people who are in the top 0.5% but not in the top 0.1%. And remember the tendency I mentioned for the previous group? Well, this group, you can see that the jump in 1985 is a lot more dramatic. And although they haven't got back to their pre-war position, certainly their income share has gone up a long way since the early 1980s. Now carry on. These are the people who are in the top 0.5% but not in the top 0.1%. That's the blue line, and again it's the same general picture. But here they are starting to get back beyond where they were immediately pre-war, although they haven't got back to where they were in the 1920s. And the final group, which is the green line, they've got back roughly to higher levels than in the 1930s, but not to the levels pre-First War. So this is the picture of income inequality from the United States. And it does definitely show that in recent periods the rich have tended to get richer, and that has been combined with people on below average earnings finding their income share has fallen. And it's fallen not just relative to the very rich, but it's fallen also relative to the average. If you look around the world, income inequality has increased in most countries, but the timing is different for different countries, and there are some countries where it hasn't happened. In Turkey and Greece, for example, inequality has actually declined, although I don't suppose that people would use the Greek economy necessarily as an example of the way to go. The OECD has concluded that, and I'm going to read this out, over the 2 decades prior to the onset of the global economic crisis, real disposable household incomes increased by an average of 1.7% a year in OECD countries. In a large majority of them, the household incomes of the richest 10% grew faster than those of the poorest 10%, so widening income inequality. Differences in the pace of income growth across household groups were particularly pronounced in some of the English-speaking countries, some Nordic countries, and Israel. In Japan, the real incomes of those at the bottom of the income ladder actually fell compared with the mid-1980s, although that may be partially to do with the fact that the Japanese labour force is declining very dramatically, so they have a huge shortage of labour, which would be the sort of thing that would push up wages at the bottom end. In OECD countries today, the average income of the richest 10% of the population is about 9 times that of the poorest 10%, a ratio of 9 to 1. However, the ratio varies widely from one country to another. It is much lower than the OECD average in the Nordic and many continental European countries, but reaches 10 to 1 in Italy, Japan, Korea, and the United Kingdom, around 14 to 1 in Israel and Turkey and the United States, and 27 to 1 in Mexico and Chile. Now, although what's happening to the very rich is interesting, I believe that it's much more important to see what's happening in the poorer income groups. The OECD conclusion, which is limited to a much shorter time period, it really only looks at what's happened in the last 30 years. So it's a much shorter time period than the US income distribution data, which I showed going back 100 years. And what they've concluded is increases in household income inequality have been largely driven by changes in the distribution of wages and salaries, which account for 75% of household income amongst working age adults. With very few exceptions, France, Japan, and Spain, the wages of the 10% best paid workers have risen relative to the 10% lowest paid. This was due to both growing earnings shares at the top and declining shares at the bottom, although top earners saw their incomes rise particularly rapidly, and earners in the top 10% have been leaving the middle income earners behind more rapidly than the lower earners have been drifting away from the middle. So that's the story. The rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, but the rich getting richer faster than the poor getting poorer. That's the position within countries. The data on emerging economies is pretty imprecise, and so I haven't quoted the statistics, because frankly I don't believe them. But the impression is, number one, the income gaps in emerging economies are much wider than in the West. Number two, that they probably have widened even further in the last 30 years as they've gone through a process of economic development. But the facts proving this are not terribly well established, so this is partially prejudice and observation, a mixture of both. Now, we've just looked at inequality in individual countries, but of course what's actually happening is that instead of countries having their own labour markets have become integrated worldwide. They've become integrated partially through migration, but also through capital flowing. So if someone can do something more efficiently in one place rather than another, then the money, the factories or whatever has tended to move to where people do it efficiently. And so you've had a sort of globalisation of the income scale. So the second thing you need to look at is what has happened to the distribution of income between countries. Now, there are definitions for this, World Bank definitions, and the whole development community has a series of definitions. And they divide the world into high-income economies, brackets, rich countries, upper middle-income countries, lower middle-income countries, and low-income countries, brackets, poor countries. And there are 70 rich countries, 54 upper middle, 56 lower middle, and 35 who are considered low-income economies. And obviously you can see that some micro-states have probably been excluded from this. And the figures here show not just what the average incomes are, the average incomes of rich countries, 33,000 US a year, upper middle, just under 9, lower middle, 3, and low income, poor countries, $1,000 a year. But also you can see the differences in education, in life expectancy at birth, and in infant mortality. And I think it's always important to check these other bits of data, which actually tend to be a bit harder when people are telling you about income and inequality and so on, just to see what development has really happened. Now, what has happened has been that the poor countries have done better than the rich countries, but the middle-income countries have done much better than both the poor countries and the rich countries. The main reason for this is that in the upper middle-income group, we have China, which has had breakneck growth, that although it's had a few hiccups recently, it's still growing, the latest data is 7.5%. And the lower middle-income economies have been boosted by India, which has also had pretty decent growth, although at the moment, again, they're having some economic difficulties. Although, you know, if you've got your economic difficulties and your sort of disasters when your growth rate is 6%, you shouldn't whinge too much. It's not like us, where we are cheering, getting economic growth of just over 1% and calling it a recovery. Well, you know, a recovery at 1% and a depression of 6%. I'd rather have the 6% depression, thank you very much. Now, you need to be a bit careful with this data because it does include the financial crash of 2007-8, and that, I think, has affected disproportionately the rich countries. But even if you took a period of data that excluded that, you'd still find that the rich countries have got rich much more slowly than the poor countries have got richer. So we have the paradox that inequality has widened within countries, but it has diminished between countries. And that paradox is at the heart of this analysis, because people very often focus on the things they can see, which is what's happening all around them, happening to their own country, and don't take account of the bigger picture, which is what's happening worldwide. Now, the next topic is why. What's going on? Is it just globalization, or is it other things? The first thing I'd like to cover is the Kuznets hypothesis. Simon Kuznets got a Nobel Prize for a seminal article he wrote in 1955. And basically he argued that as a society develops from an agricultural society to an industrialized one, inequality within that society grows. Average earnings of industrial workers increase relative to those of farm workers. As development continues, inequality amongst industrial workers also increases. As a society moves into a more advanced stage, though, the wealth starts to be redistributed. You'll notice I gave the example of Mexico and Chile, where the ratio of incomes to the rich and the poor is 27-1. As they reach the stage where we are in Britain, that inequality drops to a ratio more like 10-1. And that's a historical observation. And I certainly think, you know, my own sense of how development works is the troops don't march in step. What happens is some people shoot out ahead. And while that is going on, you do get a widening of the income gaps. let me then bring this in to the overall thing. The OECD have looked, again, very closely at this, and part of the rise in inequality has come from things like household organisation. The growth in single-parent families has increased the number of people in the bottom 10% and has made it more difficult for them to earn an income compared with others, and that has biased the results. The thing they've given biggest attention to is something called SBTC, which sounds like the sort of disease you get if you're excessively friendly. Skill-biased technical change. And that, they believe, is the thing that's had the biggest impact. And I think I would concur with that. Although as an observation, in the 19th century, industrialization was putting in machines. And the people who destroyed the machines were the skilled workers, because the machines took away their jobs. The initial phase of industrialization was that the skilled employees had their jobs taken away by the machines that came in, which gave jobs, increased numbers of jobs, to the unskilled employees. And the whole process of industrialization destroyed a lot of skilled jobs and replaced them with very unskilled jobs in manufacturing. The new process of industrialization is very computer-based, however, and that has had a changed impact. And I guess the sort of way to think about it, imagine the most sophisticated tool that we have is a spade. Even the very best performer with a spade can only shift 4 times more earth than the average. If the best, most sophisticated machine is a computer, though, first of all, it really helps the productivity of those who really know how to use it. And it can create incomes millions of times more for those who really know how to use it well than those who are not very computer literate and just use it to play games or whatever. So the nature of this particular industrial revolution, which is based very heavily on information technology and communications technology, is a revolution that is biased towards the skilled. And that seems to be the single biggest factor really driving the gap in income. However, I would like to focus on a different issue, which is the organisation of companies, because I think that also is a factor explaining it. Now, to understand this, you need to go back a bit in history. What you need to understand is that for most of the post-war period, businesses didn't actually make very much profit, and the profits returns tended to go down, not up. And when inflation came in the late 60s, early 70s, effectively it produced a shareholder revolt. And what the shareholders said is, these managers aren't making our companies sufficiently profitable. We are being exploited as shareholders. And what then developed was an attempt to try and deal with what economists call the principal-agent problem, which is to make the interests of the managers move into line with the interests of the shareholders. And this was done through profit-related schemes, share option schemes, and so on. And this massively pushed up the salaries of top managers, and it also pushed up the salaries of people who worked in the financial institutions, who were really working quite hard to ensure that the companies that they invested in performed. And that, I think, has got a lot to do with the change in income inequality. Now, I've got the figures here for profits in the United States. These are figures for profits in the UK. These are the most detailed stuff we've had from gross operating surplus share of GDP in the US, where you can see it bottomed out in the 70s and has been edging up since, although not back to pre-war levels. Rather the same sort of general picture as you see for inflation as well. And we won't come on to Manchester United quite yet. I think you can see what's been happening there. That as shareholders try to make companies more profitable, they put a lot more pressure on managers through these incentive schemes. And it's these incentive schemes which I believe have been, as well as skill-based technical change, they've driven the widening of the gap of the top 1%, who, after all, are mainly business or financial executives. Now, globalization has played a role in Western economies because a lot of the jobs at the less skilled end have been taken over by the other economies. So that has played a role at the bottom end of the income distribution, in addition to the role of technical change. But globalization has not been the main driver of income inequality, it's these other factors. And they seem to be the key ones. Now, all this is pretty heavy stuff, so I thought I'd lighten it. And I thought I'd look at something we all know a little bit about, some of us more than others, which is football. And in a sense, the nature of football has remained unchanged over the entire post-war period. The rules are still that you have to kick a ball about and hopefully get it in the net, and at the same time try and stop the other guy from trying to get the ball into your net. And these rules have been the same. But at another level, football has changed completely. I had season tickets to Chelsea last year, and I noticed that not only did the players look fairly fit, they didn't have an ounce of excess fat, but the referees and the referees' assistants, who I used to call linesmen, also looked fit. And the whole thing had become a very different sort of performance for a lot of podgy characters. You used to have footballers with pot bellies in the 1960s. You don't really see that today. And the average referee was a sort of slug. They're a bit different now. They all, even the referee's assistants, don't have an ounce of excess fat. The nature of football is the revenues have changed. This gives Manchester United, who are the current Premier League champions. I'm a supporter of Manchester United because I live in London. But more importantly, because I was born 3 miles from the ground. And as you can tell from my northern accent, I'm a genuine Mancunian. And I've always been a supporter of these as far back as I can remember. Even when I lived in Asia, which of course is the other main basis of support for Manchester United besides London. The match day revenues, which are the they're the middle shade of green, they're the ones on the right-hand side. The match day revenues now only account for 35% of Manchester United's income. Commercial, which is selling replica kit to you and me, accounts for 28%, that's the lighter shade. But the biggest single slice, now overtaking match day revenues. And by the way, match day revenues don't just include the entry price, they also include the price for the beer and the poisonous pies and various other things you get. But the biggest single slug is TV rights, who account for 37% of the income. And of course, this is global. And if you look at how Manchester United's revenues have changed, and I've gone back to 68, 69, there isn't detailed data for every single year, so you have to find various people's theses to get the precise information. But Manchester United's income in the year 68, 69 was £310,000. That was the whole club's income for the whole year. its income for the last season, in current pounds, was £320 million. In real terms, it's a rise from 4.2, I've done this in 2010 pounds, from 4.2 million to 290 million. Now, what's happened to footballers' earnings while all this has gone on? In 1961, they still had a salary cap. There was a maximum wage that you were allowed to pay. And that was £20 a week. And the top footballers were those who were on the maximum, and they got their £20. The average Premier League player now takes home just under £40,000 a week. They get paid more the next week, and the week after, and the week after that as well. I mean, it is quite interesting. I think most of us, we think of our salaries in annual terms. Footballers think of their salary in weekly terms, because either their minds can't process very long numbers, or there are so many zeros on the end for the annual one, it really doesn't matter. It's much better just to look at how much they've got each week. In 1971, and I'm jumping around year from year, but that's because the information jumps around a bit, the easily available information anyway. A top footballer was in what was then the League Division 1, got paid 4 times what a player in the lower leagues earned. That was the old League Division 4. And a player in League Division 4 was on less than average earnings. And a lot of them were part-time and supplemented their income with a job, because you actually got paid more in those days for working than for kicking a ball around. Something that's changed since then. This gives the comparison today. An average Premier League footballer gets 50 times what a player in a lower league gets. Now, a player in the lower league now gets paid more than average earnings, although there's still quite a lot of them part-time. But someone in the Premier League gets 50 times what someone in the League Division 2 gets. However, it's a bit more interesting to look at what the stars get. Now, they used to be notoriously reticent about how much they earned, whereas today they broadcast it all over the tabloid press. But you can occasionally get a throwaway comment that gives you that. So Bobby Charlton, in 1972, got £45,000 for his testimonial, or at least that's as much as he declared for tax purposes. And he commented that that was three years' earnings. Now, what that meant was he was earning £15,000 a year. Now, if you go back to the previous slide, the player in the top league got £7,500. So Bobby Charlton got paid twice the average. Now, in some senses, his equivalent today is Wayne Rooney, although I don't think Wayne will ever become Sir Wayne. And he gets paid 14.6 million a year. So in other words, he gets paid 10 times the average, whereas Bobby Charlton got paid twice the average. So not only has the top league got paid more than the people elsewhere, but the stars within the top league have got paid much more relative to the others who may even play in the same team as them. There really has been a sort of winner-takes-all result. Now, what does this mean? Well, I think what's important from this is it shows this is something where what really has driven the revenues has been globalisation. And I sense that that surface has just been scratched. My guess is that the salaries of top footballers has got a lot further to go upwards. And I think we will see football clubs become many times richer than they currently are. But the top stars will earn the same proportion, roughly, of the increased income. And so whereas top players at the moment, Ronaldo's just signed a new contract with Real Madrid for 25 million a year, I don't think the day of a footballer earning 100 million a year is all that far away. I'm certain we will see it in the next 10 years. Because I think in this particular sort of sport, all the pressures are making for massively increased inequality. Now you may think that the bulk of the super rich are celebs, actors, people in entertainment, footballers, people who play other forms of sport, etc. But in the United States, there is some quite detailed analysis of who actually comprise the very rich. And I'm quoting from a study by Paul Krugman. There's a separate study by two IRS economists, Kaplan and Rao, who look at the proportion of the wealthy. And what this shows, arts, media and sport actually only accounts for 3% of the top 0.1% of income earners. So actually the bulk of rich people are not celebs. They're people you've probably never heard of. Although I noticed that there's a big role for lawyers, for people in real estate, medical, and even, I'm glad to say, professors. 1.1% of the rich are professors. That is a really quite cheering result. So I think we're in a slightly different situation here, where what is driving the wealth is more to do with the sort of industrial organisation that I'm talking about, and the much higher fees earned in the financial sector and paid top executives as part of the process of trying to drive companies away from their inbuilt sluggishness and make them more profitable. I think that's a key force. Now, two questions immediately arise. Is this trend going to continue? And what should we do about it? The first question, whereas I think footballers are going to continue to get richer, I don't think that finances and businessmen will get much richer relative to the average. I think where we are now is probably the peak of the cycle. And the reason for that is there's a limit to the amount that shareholders are prepared to pay back to the managers to align their interests with. And I cannot see it being worthwhile for shareholders to pay much more than they currently pay, as there is a sufficiently large pool of talent available to them, so that if someone says it's too expensive, they can just go and get someone else. So my feeling is we're pretty close to the natural limit there. Now the second question is, should we do anything about it? Well, I'm going to make myself very unpopular here, because I think, although there are various people who I would consider overpaid, I don't think that we should get too upset about it. Already we tax them pretty highly, and taxing them higher almost certainly reaches the point of diminishing returns. All the studies have shown that get less tax revenue to tax it up on the rich, because they're very internationally available, and they're also quite clever at sorting the money away. The second thing is that you do tend to cut off your nose to spite the face if you impose more taxes on the super rich. What tends to happen is that they take their economic activities away from your country, and the people who lose out are more the poor than the rich. So I think it's a pretty short-sighted thing. It may make you feel good to tax the rich, but that's not the answer. I do think, though, that if you follow the analysis so far, what we see is it's profitable businesses that drive high earnings. Now, you can make your business profitable either by doing a good job and serving your customer well and being very efficient, or you can do it by ripping off your customer. And I would argue that excessively high pay is a symptom of the product market, not the labour market. That's why I'm translating English into technical jargon. And what you should do is, if, for example, bankers earn too much, and you think it's because they rip off their customers, you should stop them ripping off their customer. You shouldn't put laws in about what bankers get paid. What you should put laws in is whether bankers should rip off their customers or not. And if they do get rich by ripping off their customers, they should stop them ripping off their customers. And I think in all sorts of industries, there are product market issues that should be addressed. And I'm in favour of a very strong competition authority that prevents people from ripping off their customers. And not just the most obvious abuses, but also things like charging excess prices for drinks or coffee or whatever when you go to a sporting event, because someone's got monopoly rights to the sale of alcohol, so they can charge 5 times the normal price. That kind of thing. We ought to have competition laws in this country that do something about that. If you did that, football salaries wouldn't be quite so high. But on the other hand, it would be much easier to enjoy a pint, and you'd probably get a rather better one when you go watch a football match. And some of the football is so dark, it's better watched after a couple of pints than otherwise. But what happens to the very rich is not actually the most important thing. What is actually much more important is what happens to the poor. And that's what the rest of this lecture is about. Now, whereas the information on inequality is quite mixed, because inequality within countries has increased, but between countries has reduced. The information on poverty is clear. There has been a growth in poverty, but not sort of World Bank type poverty, in some of the advanced nations and in some of the middle income nations. But the really poor grinding poverty has diminished dramatically. In 1990, or in the year 2000, but based on 1990, we had the Millennium Goals to halve poverty by 2015. And all the anti-globalisation campaigners said it was very unlikely that we would do this, we would achieve this. Actually, they halved poverty compared to the 1990 base in 2005. By 2015, it looks as if poverty worldwide will have been cut from the 1990 level by 75%. That is amazing. It's quite dramatic. And where has it happened? It's happened especially in Asia. In 2005, on the official definitions of poverty, you had 300 million poor in East Asia. 2015, only 53 million. South Asia, in 2005, 583 million in poverty. 2015, down to 145 million. The total number of poor, which was over 2 billion in 1990, down to 1.3 billion in 05, under a billion in 2010, and under 600 million in 2015. Down from 40% of the world's population to 25% of the world's population to less than 10% of the world's population. That is dramatic. Although 600 million people poor is still 600 million too many. The poor are still largely concentrated in Africa, but even then, whereas in 2005 a majority of the African population was poor, 2015 that's expected to be down to 40%. In some senses, the countries which are emerging fastest are the countries emerging in Africa. But there remain some issues in poor countries, and also in failed states. Now nearly half of world poverty is in failed states, and we've got the awful example of Syria failing today, which is driving growth in poverty there. So poverty is starting to have a very different effect worldwide. These numbers are quite dramatic. I mean, I realised before I started the research on this that the number had come down, but even I was staggered when I looked at the detail to see exactly how. There are two different sources of information on this. There's a World Bank study which is slightly less optimistic, but the methodology is less good. And then this study is by Brookings, who are very respected, and they're not sort of sterilized extremists of any kind. They're actually probably centre-left, if anything, but they are highly respected for their knowledge on subjects like this. Now, the second important thing is that what has reduced poverty has been globalization and trade. It's the economic success that has done it. Aid has contributed less than 2% to the reduction of poverty, and charity, although it's no doubt important in individual situations, has contributed less than 1%. The thing that's really made the difference is economics, and that has made a huge impact. Now, the anti-globalization movement have got some sophisticated economic policies for this, and they've tried to campaign against globalization. And I say to them, look at this carefully, check the facts. I'm sorry, but what the anti-globalization movement is campaigning for would make the poor poorer, not richer. And it is interesting that anti-globalization is not just an extreme left thing. It's not just the Occupy movement. It's also got people like the Austrian Freedom Party, Jean-Marie Le Pen with his daughter, Marine Le Pen, which sounds like a position in the French Navy, and the Lega Nord in Italy are also anti-globalization. It's the sort of policy that seems to attract extremists of all hues, a sort of special economic policy that is especially attractive to all kinds of liberties. Well, I just say to them, think, check. This is something that has done so much for the poor that campaigning against it is something which I think is extremely ill-advised. So, let me just go through the main points again, because it is a bit complicated. Income inequality in most countries has increased in recent years, but the effects of this have been offset by a fall in inequality between countries. Poor countries have got richer relative to rich countries, and middle-income countries have got richer still. Globalization is one of the causes, but others include information technology and the impact of shareholders trying to incentivize better performance for managers, which has led to managers getting paid rather more. In the early 70s, top footballers earned 4 times the earnings of lower league footballers, while stars earned twice the top league average. Today's top footballers get 50 times the earnings, and the stars get 10 times even what top footballers get. And this has been driven very clearly by TV, by the impact of technology and globalization. And as pay-per-view extends and globalization takes soccer into many more markets, I'm afraid that this process will continue for a while, whether we like it or not. But while all this has been going on at the top end, poverty has been reduced dramatically. And the number of people in poverty by 2050 is set to be down by 3/4 from the number of 1990. And it's not aid, it's not charity, but economics and trade that have driven it. That is important. My favourite priest is a gentleman of whom there is a statue in Times Square in New York. He's a man called Father Francis Duffy. And he was the chaplain to the fighting 69th, who were the regiment of New Yorkers, mainly New York Irish, who fought in the First World War. And he's a chaplain down in the trenches with them. And by all accounts, he was a very brave man. And in the 1920s, he was probably the most famous priest in New York. In fact, he probably is the most famous priest in New York ever. And that's why there's a statue of him, and not some entrepreneur or some theatre person in Times Square. And Francis Duffy's motto was to send people out into the world with warm hearts and cool heads. And my message to the anti-globalization campaigners is you may have warm hearts, but if you've got hot heads that can't understand them, you will be trying to make the poor poorer, not richer. And my message to them is think and analyse carefully. Look at the facts. And what you will see is that globalisation has made the poor richer and has been one of the most dramatic forces that we have seen for combating poverty, and something we should be very grateful for. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen.